Simone knew Adrian had lied before she saw his signature, because people only lowered their voices that carefully when the truth could not survive normal volume. Rain streaked the windows of the black Bentley as it stopped outside Olivia Grant's brownstone, and from beneath the bookstore awning across the street, Simone watched Adrian step onto the curb with a crimson portfolio tucked beneath his arm. He held an umbrella over Olivia while she searched through her handbag, then handed her the portfolio and pointed toward a page visible through the clear sleeve. Simone recognized the Bellwether Theater address immediately, along with the acquisition code used by Adrian's development company, even though he had promised 3 nights earlier that Whitmore had no financial interest in the neighborhood. Olivia said something Simone could not hear. Adrian answered without smiling, and then both looked toward the sealed document as though it contained a problem neither wanted attached to daylight. Simone lowered the bakery box in her hands, feeling the 8-word note inside her coat become suddenly childish. "I think we are finally ready for forever." The question that replaced it was colder and far more difficult to dismiss. If Adrian had been negotiating behind her back, was the theater the only part of her life he had quietly placed on a balance sheet? She returned to their apartment before he did, moving through the rooms without switching on the lights because darkness allowed her to observe what Hope had spent years explaining away. Their Florence guides remained stacked beside the fireplace. The jazz record Adrian played on occasional Sundays waited beneath a layer of dust, and the velvet ring box remained hidden inside the nightstand where she had discovered it months earlier. She had never opened the box, partly because she respected his intention and partly because she feared learning how long a promise could sit untouched before it became another postponed plan. Adrian had missed her final Bellwether presentation rehearsal that afternoon, then sent flowers with a message saying an investor crisis had become unavoidable. Simone had believed him because his work emergencies always arrived wearing the costume of necessity, and because loving someone ambitious required an endless supply of reasonable explanations. Tonight, however, the red portfolio had given shape to every suspicion she had been ashamed to name. His home office stood at the end of the hallway, orderly enough to suggest nothing private had ever happened there. Simone opened the unlocked filing cabinet first, finding tax records, development schedules, and neighborhood studies that revealed little until a folded site map slipped from behind a stack of board reports. The Bellwether district had been divided into parcels marked with projected acquisition prices, demolition contingencies, and a shaded boundary surrounding the theater itself. Beside the shaded block, Adrian had written 4 words in his unmistakable hand: "Hold until council vote." A second note beneath it read, "Grant option expires Friday." Simone photographed both pages, then found an email printout in which Olivia's investment group discussed preserving cultural value while unlocking premium residential yield. The language was polished, evasive, and familiar. It described destruction as though the right vocabulary could make it responsible. She returned everything exactly as she had found it, although the discipline required more effort than anger would have. At the kitchen counter, she set down the lemon cake they always shared after important events, removed the white envelope from her coat, and unfolded the note she had rewritten for 3 days. The 8 words looked like they belonged to a woman who still believed timing was the only obstacle between them. Simone turned the page over and added 1 sentence beneath the original message. "Before you ask where I went, ask yourself what you signed tonight." She placed the envelope beside the ring box, set her apartment key on top, and packed only what she could carry without turning departure into a performance. Adrian entered 22 minutes later with wet shoulders, grocery store flowers, and an apology already forming before he noticed the untouched cake. He called Simone's name twice, then found the key, the note, and the closed velvet box, waiting together like evidence from 3 different versions of their future. His first expression was confusion, followed by fear, then recognition so precise it removed the color from his face. He read the final sentence again, crossed the hallway, and opened the office cabinet with hands that no longer moved confidently. The map remained in place, but the corner of the email printout sat 1 inch farther left than he remembered. Adrian stood alone in the darkened room, understanding that Simone had not left because of Olivia, the gala, or one missed dinner. She had found the decision he had made for her, and she had finally refused to live inside another future designed without her consent. Adrian called Simone until dawn, then stopped, when each unanswered attempt began to feel less like concern and more like another demand for immediate access. He canceled his morning meetings, ignored 3 messages from the board, and sat beside the lemon cake while daylight revealed the ordinary apartment she had made livable around his absences. Her coffee mug remained beside the espresso machine, her drafting pencils stood sharpened in a ceramic cup, and the Florence reservation waited inside a guidebook he had never opened. The tickets had been purchased 6 months earlier for the week after the Bellwether Council vote, which meant Simone had built a celebration around a future he had endangered, while believing secrecy would protect them both. Adrian knew the option agreement was not a demolition contract, yet the distinction sounded weak even inside his own thoughts. He had signed it to prevent Victor Hale's consortium from controlling the theater district, but he had withheld the truth because he feared Simone would oppose any private acquisition, including one he intended to convert into a non-profit trust later. In other words, he had protected her work by removing her right to decide how it should be protected. At noon, Daniel Harris arrived carrying 2 coffees and the expression of a friend who had already read the emergency board messages. Daniel served as Whitmore's chief financial officer, but he had known Adrian long before either man owned suits expensive enough to disguise panic. After reading Simone's note, he asked whether she had seen the entire option agreement. Adrian said she had likely found only the map and a printed summary. Daniel set his coffee down. "Then she thinks you sold the theater." Adrian looked toward the hallway. "I told her Whitmore was not involved." Daniel waited, forcing him to hear his own sentence. "You were involved before Whitmore was," Adrian admitted. "I used a holding company to keep Victor from moving first." Daniel's jaw tightened, not because the strategy surprised him, but because its personal cost had been obvious to everyone, except the man who arranged it. "You could have told her there were things you could not disclose," he said. "Instead, you lied because honesty might have changed your plan." Across the Hudson, Simone sat inside a furnished apartment belonging to a colleague on sabbatical, staring at the photographs from Adrian's office, while her phone vibrated against the table. She had slept less than an hour, yet exhaustion felt secondary once Thomas Reed, her managing partner, called with news that the Bellwether preservation hearing had been moved forward by 12 days. Victor's consortium had submitted a competing proposal that preserved the theater's facade while replacing the interior with luxury retail and a private performance venue. Worse, the structural engineer supporting Simone's bid had withdrawn that morning, citing an unexpected conflict of interest after accepting consulting work from a Victor-funded subsidiary. Without a certified report, the council could dismiss her restoration plan before public testimony began. Thomas asked whether Adrian might know what was happening, and Simone answered that she no longer knew which questions Adrian had earned the right to answer. Olivia visited Whitmore's office that afternoon, carrying the same crimson portfolio Simone had seen in the rain. She listened while Adrian explained that Simone had discovered the map, then admitted the secondary clause he had overlooked during final negotiations. If Whitmore failed to complete the acquisition by Friday, Olivia's investment group could assign its option to another qualified buyer, and Victor had already offered a premium. Adrian stared at her. "You told me the secondary clause was standard." Olivia removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "It is standard, but Victor approached 2 members of my board after you delayed closing." Adrian asked why she had not called him. Olivia's answer arrived without polish. "Because I thought pressure would make you finish the deal, and because I believed you would eventually choose the profitable version of your promise." She had not sabotaged Simone's project, but she had underestimated how aggressively Victor intended to eliminate it. By evening, Adrian drove to Simone's firm, where Thomas met him in the lobby and refused to disclose her address. Adrian handed over a sealed copy of the complete option agreement, along with a written waiver allowing Simone's legal team to review every Bellwether document he controlled. Thomas accepted the package but blocked the elevator. "She does not need another explanation tonight," he said. "She needs to know whether you are helping because the theater matters or because losing her finally made it matter." Adrian had no honest answer, and Thomas recognized the silence before stepping aside. Back in the car, Adrian received a notice summoning him to an emergency board meeting, followed by a separate message from Daniel containing a payment record tied to the bellwether maintenance contractor. The invoice had been approved by someone inside Whitmore after midnight, and the authorization belonged to an executive whose name Adrian had trusted for 14 years. The name on the authorization was Evelyn Shaw, Whitmore's Senior Director of Acquisitions, a woman whose loyalty had always appeared inseparable from her belief that Adrian would eventually choose growth over hesitation. Daniel cautioned that the payment alone proved nothing. The contractor maintained several Whitmore properties, and Evelyn could claim the bellwether invoice had been coded incorrectly. Adrian forwarded the record to the city attorney anyway, then asked Daniel to trace every related transfer without using company systems that Evelyn might monitor. For once, he resisted the instinct to confront the suspected betrayal immediately, understanding that anger without proof would warn whoever had arranged the payment. That restraint lasted less than 4 hours. When Evelyn suggested at the emergency meeting that bellwether could be acquired cheaply once structural realities corrected public sentiment, Adrian heard knowledge she should not possess and accused her before the other directors. Evelyn denied any misconduct, demanded evidence, and watched his credibility weaken as he admitted he had none beyond an internal payment and a phrase that could be interpreted several ways. The board postponed the acquisition vote, but ordered Adrian to stop sharing information outside the company. He agreed publicly, then called Simone before leaving the conference room because he believed the possible danger outweighed the directive. She answered only after he used Thomas's office line, and her silence carried enough distance to change the way he spoke. Adrian explained that Evelyn had authorized payment to a contractor with bellwether access, then warned that the building should be inspected before the next storm. Simone replied that Marcus Lee, an independent engineer Thomas had found that morning, was already inside the theater. "Send the record to the city," she said. "I did." Adrian hesitated. "There is more, but I cannot prove it yet." Simone's voice hardened. "Then do not ask me to trust the part you cannot prove." He almost told her he had never asked for blind trust, but the lie died before reaching his mouth. Marcus discovered the damaged drainage valve behind the eastern stage wall shortly after sunset. The cut through the metal was too clean to be corrosion, and fresh water had spread beneath a sealed maintenance corridor where old support beams met the foundation. Another heavy storm could trigger visible movement in the wall, allowing Victor's team to argue that emergency demolition was cheaper than restoration. Simone photographed the valve, the cut surface, and the access panel before city inspectors arrived. Someone anonymously reported that her team had altered the building to inflate restoration costs, forcing officials to close the site and confiscate Marcus's tools pending investigation. Volunteers gathered outside the police barrier in stunned silence, while reporters asked whether Simone's personal relationship with Whitmore's chief executive had given her access to confidential property plans. The accusation reached Adrian before Simone's call did. He left the board dinner without explanation, drove to Bellwether, and crossed the street toward the cameras until Simone stepped directly into his path. "Do not," she said quietly. "If you stand beside me now, every headline becomes about us." Adrian stopped, anger visible but contained. "They are using you to bury what happened inside." Simone glanced toward the reporters. "Then give the city evidence, not another photograph of a powerful man rescuing the woman he lied to." The words landed harder because they were accurate. Adrian handed her a folder containing the payment record, Evelyn's authorization trail, and his correspondence with Olivia about Victor's secondary claim. Simone accepted it without softening. "You should have given me this before accusing Evelyn." Adrian said he had acted too quickly, then added that the board would likely suspend him if the documents became public. "That is not my decision," Simone replied. "It never should have been." The folder led Thomas and Marcus to a security contractor who remembered admitting a bellwether maintenance crew after hours 2 weeks earlier. The access request had come from Evelyn's assistant, although the assistant insisted she had processed it under standing authority without knowing its purpose. The evidence remained circumstantial until Daniel recovered a deleted calendar entry from Evelyn's account referencing a private meeting with Victor and Olivia at the Whitmore Club. Olivia denied attending, then admitted she had declined the invitation after learning Victor planned to pressure the city through building safety concerns. Her omission infuriated Adrian, who accused her of protecting her board while Simone's project collapsed. Olivia answered with equal force. "Do not make me the only coward in this room, because you finally discovered yours." That evening, Adrian returned to the apartment and opened the nightstand drawer where Simone had left the ring box. He considered driving to Hoboken, confessing everything, and asking her to believe that his intentions had been different from his actions. Instead, he closed the drawer and sent one message through Thomas. "I have additional evidence, but I will deliver it to your attorney, not to you." Simone read the sentence twice, recognizing the restraint without mistaking it for repair. Before she could respond, Marcus called with worse news. The city had accelerated the demolition review, and unless they produced an independent structural guarantee within 5 days, Bellwether could be condemned before the sabotage investigation established who had damaged it. Simone spent the next morning inside a temporary project office across from the shuttered theater, coordinating engineers, attorneys, preservation groups, and volunteers who had begun treating exhaustion as though it were a moral obligation. Marcus believed the eastern wall could be stabilized, but the emergency work required specialized equipment and a $2 million bond before the city would reopen the building. Thomas offered part of the firm's reserves, while a neighborhood foundation pledged another $250,000 if larger donors followed. Simone refused to ask Whitmore for money, not because she doubted the company could provide it, but because Bellwether could not become proof that private power was necessary to repair damage private power had enabled. She contacted every institution that had previously praised the project, discovering how quickly public admiration became procedural caution once risk entered the room. At Whitmore, Evelyn called an emergency board session and presented evidence that Adrian had transferred internal documents to Simone's legal team, exposed the company to litigation, and concealed the option agreement from directors during preliminary negotiations. None of the accusations was entirely false, which made Adrian's defense more difficult. He admitted withholding information, then explained that the secrecy had allowed Victor and Evelyn to manipulate the property without public scrutiny. Evelyn demanded that he retract the allegation unless prosecutors filed charges. Adrian refused, but when one director asked whether his judgment had been compromised by Simone's departure, he lost control of the room. "My judgment was compromised long before she left," he said. "I believed being the smartest person at the table gave me the right to decide who deserved the truth." The statement sounded honest, yet it also confirmed the board's fear that Adrian had become emotionally unpredictable. They suspended him before noon, froze his access, and appointed Evelyn interim chief executive pending an outside investigation. Daniel remained inside at Adrian's request, although their decision appeared to many employees like cowardice on one side and betrayal on the other. Reporters gathered outside Whitmore as Adrian exited alone, asking whether he had endangered shareholders to win back an ex-girlfriend. One article described Simone as an ambitious architect exploiting a failed romance to secure public sympathy, while another suggested Bellwether's damage had been staged by preservation activists. Simone read neither story completely, but donors did. 2 foundations withdrew, leaving the stabilization bond farther out of reach than it had been the previous night. Adrian arrived at Thomas's office, carrying an encrypted drive containing his personal board correspondence, private notes, and archived messages from the option negotiations. Simone agreed to meet him in the conference room because the deadline had made avoidance a luxury. Adrian explained that he had removed unrelated employee information before copying the files, which delayed delivery and allowed Evelyn to move first. Simone asked why he had confronted her without proof. Because I was angry, he said, and because I still confuse urgency with permission. She looked at him for several seconds. You almost destroyed the investigation, because being right mattered more than being useful. Adrian nodded, visibly resisting the instinct to justify himself. I know. The answer did not resolve anything, but its incompleteness sounded more human than another polished confession. Their attorney discovered 3 useful items on the drive: a message from Evelyn requesting Bellwether's unreleased inspection schedule, a reference to using weather exposure before municipal review, and a deleted attachment number matching Victor's contractor invoice. The record strengthened the criminal referral but did not provide money for stabilization. Adrian offered to guarantee the bond personally. Simone refused immediately, accusing him of trying to purchase his way back into the center of the story. Adrian's frustration surfaced. The wall does not care why the money arrives, Simone stood. The community does, because the donor controls the emergency and then controls the gratitude. He answered too sharply, telling her that principles would not hold up a collapsing roof. The room went quiet, and Adrian recognized the old arrogance only after it had already spoken. Simone left without responding, while Thomas told Adrian that 1 year of regret had apparently taught him less than 1 week of pressure could expose. Adrian drove away furious with her refusal, then ashamed that frustration had transformed concern into contempt so quickly. Instead of forcing another conversation, he contacted the Civic Foundation that had supported Bellwether's youth workshops and offered an unconditional guarantee through an independent donor pool. The foundation required 3 protections: no naming rights, no influence over the restoration board, and no disclosure of his involvement until after the city hearing. Adrian accepted immediately, but the foundation could cover only half the bond. Simone learned of the offer through its director, not through Adrian, and approved it because the structure prevented private control. The remaining $1 million still had to be raised within 72 hours, while a new forecast warned that the strongest storm of the season would reach Manhattan the following night. The neighborhood campaign began before sunrise, led by volunteers who had spent months painting walls, cataloging old programs, and persuading local businesses that Bellwether belonged to more than architectural history. Simone recorded a 3-minute message explaining the emergency without mentioning Adrian, Evelyn, or the scandal surrounding Whitmore. She spoke about the theater's free youth performances, its senior music classes, and the families who had used its lobby as a cooling center during summer outages. The appeal spread through former performers, neighborhood schools, preservation groups, and thousands of people who had never entered the building but understood what it meant to lose a place that held collective memory. By afternoon, the campaign had raised $400,000, an astonishing amount that still left the project exposed. Olivia arrived at Thomas's office carrying bank records from her investment group and asked to speak with Simone privately. She admitted that Victor had approached her board months earlier with a plan to finance the luxury redevelopment if Bellwether failed its safety review. Olivia had opposed sabotage, but she had withheld the meeting because exposing Victor would have endangered her position and revealed how close her firm had come to approving the deal. I told myself I had not crossed the line, she said. Then I watched everyone else stand on it while I protected my chair. Simone asked why she was speaking now. Olivia placed the records on the table. Because Adrian lost his company for telling part of the truth, and I kept mine by withholding the rest. The documents linked Victor's holding company to the contractor who damaged the valve and showed that Evelyn had received a consulting guarantee if Whitmore completed the redevelopment under new leadership. The city attorney obtained emergency warrants, while Whitmore's outside investigators removed Evelyn from the building before the afternoon board session. She denied authorizing sabotage, but admitted sharing restricted inspection information with Victor because she believed Adrian's hesitation threatened shareholders. The distinction did not protect her. Victor's consortium withdrew from the council hearing, and several investors offered cooperation in exchange for leniency. The evidence cleared Simone's team of wrongdoing, yet Bellwether still faced the same physical reality. The wall required stabilization before the storm, and the donor pool remained more than $500,000 short. Adrian learned the amount while sitting in Daniel's kitchen in Connecticut, where he had been staying since selling the apartment. Daniel's daughter had left an unfinished birdhouse on the table, its roof crooked because they had stopped work when the investigation began. Adrian asked whether Daniel could arrange a bridge loan through Whitmore now that Evelyn had been removed. Daniel said the board would likely approve, but only if Adrian returned as chief executive and publicly framed the crisis as a management failure rather than a criminal conspiracy. The agreement would restore his authority, protect the company's value, and release the money before the storm. Adrian accepted before Daniel finished explaining the conditions. At Whitmore, however, the board's legal team added a final clause requiring the Bellwether Trust to grant the company priority development rights on adjacent parcels. Adrian read the language twice, then called Simone and told her the bond had been secured without mentioning the clause. She arrived at City Hall prepared to sign, until Thomas noticed the attached development schedule. Simone looked at Adrian across the conference table, disbelief replacing relief. "You did it again," she said. Adrian argued that the rights did not include the theater and would finance long-term maintenance. "You promised the money was clean." Adrian's face tightened. "The wall could fail tonight." Simone closed the folder. "Then let it fail before I sign away the neighborhood under emergency pressure." The words frightened everyone in the room, including Simone, but she refused to confuse survival with surrender. Adrian walked into the hallway, furious that she would risk the building over parcels that might never be developed, until Daniel followed and asked whether he truly believed that. Adrian looked through the glass at Simone standing beside volunteers who had raised nearly half the bond in one day. He finally understood that he had not repeated his mistake because the contract was identical. He had repeated it because fear still made control feel responsible. Adrian returned to the board, rejected reinstatement, and instructed his attorney to sell enough personal Whitmore shares to fund the remaining bond without conditions. The sale required accepting a price below market and permanently surrendering his controlling vote, but the transfer cleared 40 minutes before the city deadline. Crews entered Bellwether as rain began striking the boarded windows. Simone remained in the lobby, while hydraulic braces were installed against the eastern wall, and water was pumped from beneath the stage. Adrian stayed outside with other volunteers, carrying equipment and coffee without entering the restricted zone. Near midnight, Marcus announced that the structure had stabilized, and exhausted applause moved through the building more softly than celebration usually did. Simone found Adrian beneath the marquee after the rain weakened. "You almost traded the neighborhood to save the theater," she said. Adrian nodded. "I know." She waited for an explanation. "I was afraid, and I reached for the thing I know best." Simone looked toward the lit windows behind him. "Control," Adrian answered without defending himself. "Yes." Bellwether survived the storm, the investigation, and the city council vote. But restoration required another 14 months of work before the public entered the building again. Evelyn pleaded guilty to conspiracy and fraud after investigators recovered messages proving she had encouraged Victor to create a safety crisis, while Olivia testified against her own board and resigned before regulators completed their review. She later joined a nonprofit investment fund specializing in community ownership, not as redemption arranged by the story, but because rebuilding a career without the protection of silence proved harder than admitting she had been wrong. Daniel became Whitmore's chief executive after shareholders approved a new governance structure, and Adrian remained a minority investor without operational authority. Some business publications described his departure as a collapse, while others presented it as a moral awakening. Adrian stopped reading both versions, because neither changed the ordinary work of learning how to live without being needed everywhere. Simone led the restoration through delays, budget revisions, contractor disputes, and one winter when a burst pipe destroyed weeks of plasterwork. Adrian did not appear whenever trouble surfaced, although the old version of him often wanted to. He attended public trust meetings when invited, volunteered on scheduled weekends, and left when his assigned work ended instead of staying until someone noticed his usefulness. Simone observed the change without rewarding each instance. allowing consistency to exist without becoming a performance staged for her forgiveness. She also faced her own uncomfortable lesson. For years, she had called endless accommodation compassion, because acknowledging her resentment would have required choices she feared making. Leaving Adrian had protected her, but remaining silent for so long had not protected either of them. The theater reopened on an October evening, beneath restored chandeliers, repaired murals, and a ceiling inscription discovered during construction. A building survives when the people inside believe they belong there. Simone stood on stage and thanked the engineers, volunteers, donors, artists, students, and neighborhood residents who had refused to let Bellwether become a decorative wall attached to someone else's profit. Adrian sat near the back with a ticket he had purchased online, applauding without waiting for his contribution to be named. After the performance, Simone found him in the courtyard speaking with Marcus about the drainage system. Adrian congratulated her, then stepped aside when volunteers approached, giving her attention back to the people whose night it was. Nearly a year later, they met again at the Community Design Summit overlooking the Hudson. Simone had delivered the closing address, while Adrian attended with scholarship students from the apprenticeship program Daniel had expanded at Whitmore. Their conversation moved through architecture, music, Simone's mother, Daniel's family, and the Bellwether's unexpectedly successful Sunday Jazz series. No crisis forced them together, which made the ease between them feel more revealing than any dramatic reunion. Before they returned inside, Adrian removed the velvet ring box from his jacket and placed it on the stone railing. Simone recognized it immediately. Adrian explained that he had kept the ring because part of him still believed enough change might earn him the right to finish the proposal he had postponed. "That is not how this works," he said, looking toward the water instead of watching her reaction. "Becoming better does not create an obligation for you." He told her he planned to sell the ring and use the money to fund Bellwether's free performances, although the trust would decide how the donation was spent. Simone rested her fingers on the box, remembering the apartment key she had left beside it 2 years earlier. "I spent a long time waiting for you to choose me," she said. "What I should have done was choose myself sooner." Adrian nodded. "I spent a long time calling provision love because it let me avoid presence." She asked whether he still listened to the jazz record they once played on Sundays. Adrian smiled and admitted he had sold the turntable with the apartment, because keeping every object had begun to feel like another way of refusing to move forward. Simone mentioned the Bellwether series, then clarified that she was sharing information, not offering forgiveness, disguised as an invitation. Adrian accepted the distinction. 2 Sundays later, he attended alone, switched off his phone, and sat near the back while a local quartet played beneath the restored ceiling. Simone arrived halfway through the first set and watched him for several minutes before deciding where to sit. Adrian did not scan the room for her, check his watch, or answer the phone vibrating silently inside his coat. When their eyes met, he smiled, but remained seated, leaving the next movement entirely to her. Simone crossed the lobby and took the empty chair beside him. They listened until the final note faded, then walked to the volunteer cafe where Adrian asked whether she had time for coffee. "1 cup," Simone said, because hope no longer required her to promise more than she honestly possessed. "1 cup," Adrian agreed, because change had finally taught him not to turn a gift into a guarantee. They remained at the small table until volunteers began stacking chairs, speaking about ordinary things that would once have been sacrificed to urgency. Outside, autumn rain touched the restored windows with the same soft rhythm that had followed Simone through Manhattan the night she left. This time, no one waited across the street, while someone else chose a different door. When they stepped outside, Adrian slowed his pace without being asked, and Simone walked beside him without abandoning herself to do it.